And I'm going to start this presentation with a long quote. Peck moved to New York in 1964. The story of video art is what I call a primal story, and it begins here at the Liberty Music Store with Peck's purchase using US grant money of a Sony portable video camera and recorder from Japan's first shipment of equipment to the US. As a tale is remembered, Peck's first video recording occurred that very day. As he was on his way home, his cab intersected with the Pope's visit to New York. Voila! The results were previewed to an art audience that very same night. Video art was born. The irony of Japanese consumer technology in the hands of a Korean in New York, filming the Pope and triggering an art movement funded by NEA and Rockefeller Foundation is delightful indeed. Perhaps this is why it has been told for now 30 years. Or by now, in 2014, this story has been told for half a century. Writing the mid-1990s, the film and TV studies scholar Mellencamp attempts to debunk this mythical beginning of video art by emphasizing the expansiveness of Peck's practice that involves a certain respect for the audience, which, for her, recites Deleuzian simulacrum that considers a copy as a positive, joyous one that denies privileged points of view and hierarchies. Mellencamp's objects of analysis are mostly sculptural works from later periods, such as TV Buddha and Alexander the Great. In this presentation, however, I want to complicate this beginning by going back in time, the time before Peck's move to New York in 1964, or more specifically, to March 11th of 1963, the opening day of Peck's first solo exhibition. By that time, the artist, born in 1932 in colonial Korea, had left his native country in 1950 and had studied music and aesthetics at the Tokyo University until coming to West Germany in 1956. Peck's first solo show, Exposition of Music Electronic Television, took place at the Gallery Parnasse in Wuppertal, Germany. Housed in the 19th century villa that belonged to Anneliese and Rolf Jarling, the gallery had the goal of promoting contemporary art that might not experience immediate commercial sales. By this time, Peck was better known for his shocking performances and his affiliation with composers like Karlheinz Stockhausen and John Cage. And he met the Jarlings at Stockhausen's premiere of Original in 1961 in Cologne. Peck's first art exhibition, or more accurately, the multimedia presentation, allowed Peck to make a transition from musical performance to art exhibition, a medium of artistic practice which, in and of itself, requires a more acute sense of the place than a musical performance. That is, the physical space of the gallery. Indeed, Peck used the staircase, the bathroom, the entrance, the toilet, and the basement, almost all parts of what made up the bourgeois house-turned gallery. This was also the first time that Peck used TV monitors for his practice and devised a new temporality with which to engage the audience. To demonstrate this point, this paper will focus on two selected installations, or what I will later argue as two situations. The first is the 11 television sets in the garden room on the ground floor, and the second is random access in the basement. So first, the television sets. These TV sets were prepared in Peck's studio in Cologne for about a year prior to the opening. Just like he would make prepared pianos, and the show actually had 3 prepared pianos, Peck manipulated the mechanisms of the cathode ray tube TVs by removing the deflection yoke, removing the focusing coil, or adding a coil, and etc. Each of the single TV sets was manipulated in different ways so that they would show a variety of electronically triggered, non-indexical abstract images on the monitors, even though they were all tuned to the same broadcasting program. Some showed negative images of what was broadcast. Others were connected to a radio or a foot-operated switch so that the geometric images on the screen, the thickness of the line or the size of the point, for example, would respond to the on-site manipulation. The viewers could turn the knob, touch the foot-operated switch, or speak into the microphone to generate different outputs. For Peck, the act of manipulating and mutating the one-way transmission of the televisual signal was an act of asserting freedom into the flow of time. As Manuela Amar, an art historian at the Freie Universität in Berlin, notes, this installation represents Peck's intervention into linear temporality. Peck used to say, and I quote, "A normal strip of time, good or bad, a time flow of only direction, as in traditional music, as in life, is destined to later or sooner to the certain death with one-way time," end quote. This installation, in this installation, not only the broadcasting signal is manipulated, but the installation with the TV sets laying on the ground or on stools also allows the audience to make up and shape their own viewing time of each screen image. Scholars, following the music critic Michael Nyman, have pointed out that the idea of this multi-screen environment was anticipated in Peck's earlier score titled Symphony for 20 Rooms, from spring of 1961, which conceptualized a presentation of 16 rooms that the audience can enter one at a time, following the order of their own choice. To emphasize here, Peck's understanding of temporality is different from task-based time or duration-based time. It is a temporality that has the potential of being multi-directional, having multiple entry points. Even though the abstract images on the TV monitors are non-indexical, in a sense that they're not indexical to what exists outside the frame, they are marked with the indexicality of time. The time of the viewer's entry into the room, the time of the viewer's encounter with the screen, and the time of the viewer's manipulation of the TV set. Hence, what is indexed here is a space-time of the situation, triggered and maintained by the sculptural presence of the TV monitors in the room, the dynamic activities of electrons through the cords and tubes, and the viewer's participation that was contingent upon all of these other elements. Random access, installed in the basement, was more interactive and participatory than the TV sets on the ground level. Pre-recorded magnetic tapes cut in different lengths were affixed directly onto the wall, forming a radiating chaos that resembled spider web-like city streets. The visitors were prompt to play with the isolated magnetic tape head by tracing the tapes and reading the sounds off the wall. Instead of winding the tape forwards and backwards, the visitors gained a random access to any part of the reels and heard the sound through the connected speaker nearby. As art historian Andrew Rofsky writes in the context of expanded cinema, Peck's random access demechanizes the mechanical consistency through its dependence on human locomotion. In random access, and I quote, "There exists no single linear path on which to methodologically advance. The viewer is forced to choose, and choose again every few inches, ever new pathways along this complex and intersecting web of connections. At each juncture, the decision produces its own feedback loop as the viewer reacts to the soundtrack she herself is producing." End quote. Building upon this beautifully described phenomenological spatial temporality, I want to argue that the geopolitical spatial temporality of pressing the pickup onto the wall of the gallery in Wuppertal, Germany, or touching the foot-operated TV switch precisely on March 11th of 1963 has to be further considered. According to Majella and Mar's meticulous research of the former West Germany's TV broadcasting schedule, ARD was the only national television broadcasting corporation in the country at the time. Omar notes, and I quote, "It is quite conceivable that Peck would have considered the evening news, with its almost life-size talking head of the news anchors and studio guests, as television material that would lend itself particularly well to manipulation." End quote. Indeed, the exhibition was open only between 7:30 and 9:30 at night, roughly coinciding with the news program schedule. A fascinating account on Peck's 1963 TV images by art historian Kristen Merring at Chicago also localizes the birth of television art. Merring contextualizes Peck's explicit homage to the kinetic paintings of the German painter Karl Otto Götz within the technological and aesthetic history of Western Europe. The military application of telecommunication technology during the World War II, to which Götz had access while serving in the army, and the belated distribution of TV sets in European homes in the immediate post-war period compared to the US, explain the electronic origins of informal paintings of Götz, which influenced Peck, who cites the painter in the 1963 exhibition catalog. In other words, the spike of technological development followed by its lag in Europe created a room for inventive manipulation of television and televisuality for someone like Peck in early 1960s, and in Germany particularly. So taking into account the multiple coordinates of time and space-time that Peck's work provokes, I now want to situate this paper within the larger and longer trajectories of my own scholarship. I am within several weeks of defending my doctoral dissertation on the aesthetics of politics in South Korean art from 1980s till today, a project that explores the artistic engagement with various themes such as democracy movement, anti-communist policy, public art, and the notion of publicness, and the genealogy of political art, and the shifting notions of post-colonial politics and collectivity over the past 30 years in Korea. You might have guessed already, but Namjoon Peck is of course not part of this dissertation. This paper on Peck constitutes the beginning of my second book project, which comes out of my investment in the politics of collaboration and participation, and for which I will devote the next several years. The teaching position that I have just accepted last month at the Department of Art History and Criticism at Stony Brook University in Long Island is a fortuitous one for this reason, because in 1968, Namjoon Peck spent time there as a resident artist upon the invitation of Isaac Nemiroff, the composer and the founder of the music department at Stony Brook, and also a brother-in-law of David Tudor, who played the premiere of John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds. The music library at Stony Brook currently has a stack of hitherto untouched boxes of archival materials produced during Peck's residency, waiting for me to discover. And when I do that, in addition to sifting through scattered texts in the forms of scholarly essays on art and technology, innumerable exhibition catalogs, and Peck's correspondences with his collaborators housed in various archives in Asia, North America, and Europe, I will keep in mind the mandates of my job as one of the first and very few full-time tenure-track academic positions in North America solely devoted to teaching modern and contemporary art of Asia. These mandates, I believe, not only concern expanding the geographic regions of our scholarly analysis, but are more importantly about continuing the critical inquiries into temporality of contemporary art that Reiko TOMII, for example, envisioned in her epistemological investigations of Kindai Bijutsu and Kendai Bijutsu, modern art and contemporary art in the Japanese context. To this end, what the renowned media art curator and Peck expert John Hannard called Peck's mercurial path should not be considered as a path, but should be considered as an interconnected ecology of the multi-sided development of technological modernity in the working in the late 1950s and in the 60s in Asia, Europe, and America. Yes, it is true that Fluxus was an international movement with a complex network of artists working simultaneously across these continents, and Peck was indeed part of it. But the line of movement that Peck's residency took, from colonial Korea to post-atomic Japan to Munich and Cologne of West Germany, and then to New York, should not be deemed as either unpremeditated, simply universal, or advancing from the most peripheral to the most cosmopolitan. I'm arguing for a serious consideration of Peck's brief return to Tokyo between his journey from Germany to New York. After the Gallery Parnasse exhibition in 1963, Peck made a trip back to Tokyo. And while living in his older brother's home near Roppongi, Peck frequented an electronic shop run by Uchida Hideo, who then introduced Peck to Abe Shuya, Peck's collaborator for Robot K456 that Peck brought with him to New York in 1964. It is also with Abe that Peck in 1969 devised the Peck-Abe video synthesizer, which would be used again and again for his later single-channel video works. While in Tokyo, Peck also befriended Ide Nobuyuki of Sony, who later became the company's president. And it is through Ide that Peck actually got his hands on a Sony Portapeck video recorder in Japan. So here, I'm not simply expanding Christine Marling's decentering of New York, that is, her transatlantic relocation of the beginning of video and television art from New York to Germany, by adding a trans-Pacific move to Japan. What I'm trying to emphasize is a move beyond the myth of origin, the ground zero, that surrounds Peck's oeuvre as a whole. To see Peck beyond the title of the pioneer of video art, we need to rethink the linear history of technological development and the organic development of individual genius. Then, what kind of methodological model should I pursue in the next several years for this project? At least for now, I can say that I will be informed by the film scholar Miriam Hanson's notion of vernacular modernism, Alexander Zoni's and Leanne Lefebvre's critical regionalism for architecture, post-colonial theories' emphasis on heterotemporality and disjunctions, in the ever so rapidly developing field of media archaeology, as well as the re-examined values of expanded cinema in conjunction with expanded sculpture, the rise of participatory art, and the recognition of haptic visuality. This going beyond the myth of origin also requires thinking through the notion of collaboration across borders and across mediums that Peck sought with his collaborators. Not only the famous individuals like John Cage, Joseph Beuys, and Charlotte Moore, but also engineers like Abe Shuya and his artistic partner, Shigeko Kuboda. The question of institution in the context of collaboration is also extremely important. If the institutional funding structure, broadcasting companies, and corporate development of technology sought a certain global circulation of new ideas and commodities, Peck's peripatetic movement and his interaction with and intervention into the hegemonic routes of circulation and transmission reveal the complexity with which the heterogeneity of modernity, as well as artistic production and reception, are triggered in specific and concrete contexts in different regions. On this note, art historian Hiroko Ikegami's tracing of the path of Robert Rauschenberg from Paris to Venice, Stockholm to Tokyo in the year 1964 serves as an important scholarly model. When conceptualizing Peck's performance at the Sogetsu Art Center in Tokyo on May 29, 1964, his participation in the High Red Center shelter plan at the Imperial Hotel, also in the same year, or Peck's collaboration with South Korean experimental artists to produce the performance Sex on the Piano at the first Sohl International Contemporary Music Festival in 1969. So on that note, I would welcome any suggestions on my initial ponderings on Peck's complex world that I know will take me to multiple directions and multiple temporalities in the next years to come. Thank you.
Much of this paper hinges on a reading of one work by an artist who may be unfamiliar to you, but I believe you'll find that it opens out onto larger and harder questions of what it means to picture the world in the atomic age, and does expand our consciousness of an art history to include the margins in which so many lived and worked. In the summer of 1974 in San Francisco, the artist Jess made this work, which he titled The Fifth Never of Old Lear. It is a collage, mid-size, and its paper elements are glued onto two wooden slabs, one slightly larger than the next, hugging this three-dimensional support like an expertly wrapped gift. The collage's flow of imagery reinforces a peculiar, soothing consistency and affinity for pattern or decoration. It is the opposite of the agitprop Dadaist tactics of Richard Hulsenbeck and Raoul Hausmann, or even the atomized spin cycle of Hannah Hawks cut with a kitchen knife. Yet the balm of such homogeneity mitigates or perhaps contends with a scene as monstrous as any Dada or surrealist nightmare. Such visual cohesion results from a consistency of medium. Most of the cut up and pasted on scraps are reproductions of engravings. The uniform use of engraving makes the collage seem much older than its years, which is not uncommon in Jess's work. Jess employs a modern visuality, collage, but his materials belong to an earlier visual culture, an obsolete technology. The process and ethos of collage, of reuse, recycling, and even rescue is made plain by the collage's insistence on its pastness. All of my work comes from salvaging, Jess once explained. It's all about rescuing or resurrecting images. Visual consistency may smooth out or conceal this nightmarish scene, but in time its pictorial logic comes into view. The collage is divided into two halves, an upper portion governed by bodies in motion and a lower portion dominated by machines. Butterflies flit across the whole. They undo any clean divide between the two halves and punctuate the dark mood with a touch of lightness. Bubbles drift up from the glass blower at center left, indicating fragility, even breakability. By this point, more than 20 years into his collage practice, Jess is clearly a master of the medium. He makes the picture appear effortless, as if it could be no other way. But this degree of seamlessness and dynamism are achieved only with tremendous skill and patience. The fulcrum for the picture's two worlds is the two men at center, a soldier and servant holding the oil lamp overhead. Their centrality is emphasized by the seal that marks the true center of the picture, a point of stillness in an otherwise thoroughly writhing image. The men clutch the covering that separates the lower realm from the upper, although it is uncertain if they reveal or cover what lies beneath. Their cohort above remains oblivious, so deeply absorbed are they in their own agonized dramas. And dramas they are. These men are all excised from an early 19th century folio illustrating Shakespeare's dramatic works. At the turn of the century, John and Josiah Boydell commissioned Britain's leading painters to illustrate Shakespearean scenes and employed dozens of engravers to translate the paintings into engravings reproduced in this volume. Some were deemed successful. Benjamin West approved of William Sharp's engraving of his King Lear, but many are mediocre. The challenge of working with such material was certainly pleasurable for Jess. This confidence in one's abilities to recognize the neglected potential of an undervalued image, to save the image, to put it bluntly, is another facet of the project of salvage. In choosing this compendium of prints, Jess had found the consummate manifestation of his own artistic practice, a practice spanning 5 decades and including painting, collage, drawing, film, book illustration, and poetry, and a practice entirely predicated on acts of appropriation and translation. Consider the sheer number of transformations that resulted in the Shakespeare volume Jess held in his hands. The prints are copies of paintings, which are illustrations of literary scenes, which describe events that were historical even in Shakespeare's time, and often themselves deeply speculative. Take, for example, the disappearance of the two princes from the Tower of London sometime around 1483, which Shakespeare amplifies in Richard III into their assassination on Richard's order. The engraving depicts the moment just before the assassination and becomes the fulcrum of Jess's collage. Jess cuts the princes from the scene so the two men now gaze upon the phantasmagoria of the machinery below. This gargantuan composite engine room derives from Issues of Scientific American from 1887, a forum for science enthusiasts and primary source document of the Industrial Revolution, one whose focus on new inventions fostered a heady atmosphere of progress. In the center, Jess places a grain belt, now transformed into a waterfall. On the left is a pair of improved triple expansion engines. The Scientific American caption tells us that Jess turns on their sides. And on the right are more engines, all flipped upside down. Here's one more. Jess made his own improvements to this new and improved industrial machinery, fusing them into a powerful and elaborate machine, a Frankensteinian creation. Of the Shakespearean murderers and madmen populating the upper realm, all of whom are caught in moments of violence or torment, the most dramatic is King Lear, lifted from Sharp's engraving. Lear, veering into madness, is caught with his companions in a brutal storm. The collage's title, The Fifth Never of Old Lear, derives from a later passage in which Lear laments the death of his loyal daughter Cordelia. Thou'lt come no more, never, 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 never. Lear's repetition of never is feverish and progressively unhinged, but the fifth never has a certain finality to it. The realization is both tragic and clear. A catastrophe has occurred. Jess will not name this catastrophe since he believed the components of his works, in his words, must all remain in flux so that no single story dominates. This is why the blanket both covers and reveals the grotesque engine room below. It is why references to the most devastating moments in Shakespeare coexist with butterflies that fly across the same surface. The Fifth Never of Old Lear presents a scene at the moment of its greatest intensity, its dramatic peak. The imagery tells us so, but the title does too. Such theatricality is signaled on the level of both sources and composition. The collage is an allegory, a theatrical staging of a catastrophic encounter between upper and lower registers. The upper register is in turmoil, prompted perhaps by the revelation below, which must be smothered at once. Above, we witness a chaotic disintegration of humanity, a breakdown of even the most basic social contract, another human being's right to live. The material culture of the 18th and 19th century gives form to this catastrophe, but it belongs firmly to the 20th century. And in what follows, I argue that Jess's confrontation with nuclear power and the atomic bomb has been translated here into the high theatricality of madness and murder and machines. Jess was born Burgess Franklin Collins in 1923 in Long Beach, California. He studied chemistry at the California Institute of Technology and, along with many others, was drafted into the Army during World War II. But here, his formation for post-war art history, at least, takes a singular turn. Jess spent 22 months in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, as a chemist working on the Manhattan Project. Though top secret at the time, we know well what the effort produced, an atomic bomb which annihilated Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the summer of 1945, and to quote Leo Szilard, the Hungarian émigré physicist who initiated the Manhattan Project, ushered in an era of devastation on an unimaginable scale. The history of the development of the atomic bomb is one of scale, an unimaginable scale, a colossal, stupendous scale of resources marshaled and consumed to produce the bomb, of enrichment facilities half a mile long that produced mere grams of weapons-grade uranium and plutonium, of the copious amounts of water needed to cool fuel slugs, and ultimately of the death and destruction caused in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In Hiroshima, 100,000 were killed instantly, 95,000 were civilians. It is no wonder that something so unfathomable would soon be linked with the mushroom cloud, an image that has such clearly delineated form, an image that can be seen, comprehended, managed, and aestheticized. At Oak Ridge, the most massive structures were those that enriched uranium, such as the K25 plant, a U-shaped facility that covered over 2 million square feet, or the Y12 complex, which eventually comprised 286 buildings. Jess arrived at this sprawling construction site in April 1943, just days after the entire area was fenced in with barbed wire and its borders monitored by guarded checkpoints. Maybe I should mention, too, that he was just 20 years old. Once inside, he would have seen astonishing pieces of visual propaganda, such as the billboard you see here. Nuclear fission occurs on the smallest scale imaginable, yet in an acute reversal, very large machinery and much of it is needed to generate atomic fission. This is an absurd scale shift, as Jess intuits when he writes, "Scientists love Dada too, they grow mushrooms 10 miles tall." A Dadaist response to this dialectic of scale and similarly unfathomable gulf between daily life at Oak Ridge and the horror of the bomb seems appropriate. And here it's worth recalling that Dada emerged as a response to the First World War. Eventually, Jess realized he was participating in something very wrong. Such evil methods were not conducive to self-esteem, he explained to the writer Rebecca Solnit. I remember the Army had secret films in color of Hiroshima immediately after it happened, showing horrible burns and sickness. People were passing out, and so was I. And he later admitted, when they dropped the bomb, I knew science was made by black magicians. This is the nightmare of the fifth never of Old Lear, the revelation beneath the blanket that leads to such murderous anguish above. Jess's treatment of the large-scale devastation that was the wartime endgame of atomic chemistry is indirect and allegorical. His is a world come undone. The very same issue of Scientific American, Jess, the ex-chemist, is, of course, the Scientific American. Sourced for the monstrous engine room, Jess also used for an astonishing, deeply strange series of paintings called the Translations. These devices represent the science that appealed to Jess, the science of the tinkerer, small-scale and alchemical, often without predetermined application, a pre-lapsarian science. This is the science he wants to rescue and preserve in paint. It could not be further from the industrial-scale big science that would produce the most destructive weapon the world had then seen. The fifth never of Old Lear, by contrast, is nightmarish, not unlike the way paintings by Hieronymus Bosch are nightmarish. And indeed, Bosch and Jess ask a shared question: how does one represent the monstrous? Jess reacted slowly to what he experienced at Oak Ridge. People are all very different, he explained. I held it off until Hanford. After the war, Jess worked as a chemist for the Hanford Engineering Works, the nation's plutonium factory in Washington state. While reluctant to discuss this period of his life, he has described the dream, what Jungians call the big dream, that constituted his break from it. And this is Jess. At one point, around 1948, when I was working with atomic chemistry, I had a very strong and convincing dream that the world was going to completely destruct by the year 1975. I'm sure the kind of work I was doing had some effect on my state of mind at the time. Soon after, Jess quit his job, dropped his last name, and moved to San Francisco. He enrolled at the San Francisco Art Institute and met the preeminent American poet Robert Duncan, with whom he exchanged marriage vows on New Year's Day, 1951. Within 2 years, his life changed radically, though it remained structurally the same until Robert's death in 1988. Jess passed away in 2004. When asked about Oak Ridge and Hanford, Jess explained, I made the break almost 50 years ago and willfully worked at erasing continuity with my life before devoting myself to art. I would be put in turmoil to rake it over. Surely we can empathize with Jess's reluctance to dwell on years spent in the service of producing weapons of mass destruction. And as that period receded into history and was supplanted by a consistent practice as an artist and life with Duncan in San Francisco, it may well have grown hazy and inconsequential, an error of youth. Yet science appears frequently in his work. Even the image of the mushroom cloud is used on occasion. This painting, If All the World Were Paper and All the Waters Sink, is an homage to Gustav Klimt. But while Klimt stitches the picture plane together like so many textiles, just scatters pattern in the wind like bits of paper, as if the yellow mushroom cloud at center tore the fabric of the picture and its world. Surely the painting is an evocation of Jess's apocalyptic dream, the presence of a self-portrait in profile, watching from the side with tarot deck in hand makes this point. Jess's dream is an origin myth, a fable convenue. It calls to mind another notorious origin myth from the same war, Joseph Boy's plane crash in the Crimea. The Tartars discovered boys in the snow, and so the story goes, wrapped his body in fat and felt, which became foundational alchemical materials in his sculptural practice. Boyce's origin myth enacts a sort of psychic survivalism, to paraphrase Benjamin Buchloh, not to mention a materialist salvage, which has affinities with Jess's struggles to come to terms with the atomic bomb and his own involvement with that project. The dream was one way of bracketing and disavowing this event. Dropping his last name was another. Just as boys would confront the aftermath of German fascism despite the war's end, so too did Jess live in the atomic age, his break with nuclear science notwithstanding. If we take Life magazine, which Jess read voraciously and cut up with similar energy, as a barometer of the cultural mood in the 1950s, the repercussion of nuclear detonation on American soil was a constant and palpable concern. This was the New World Order, and its traces were everywhere. Jess was hardly the only artist to depict the mushroom cloud during the Cold War. Unsurprisingly, Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, and James Rosenquist all painted one of the most charged icons of the age, an image almost too much for the mind to comprehend. Here's the Warhol in his signature silkscreen technique. Lichtenstein. James Rosenquist, the mushroom cloud is on the right. Jess's insistence on allegory is part of what sets him apart from the pop treatments of the mushroom cloud, which focus instead on the image's iconicity. In the hands of Warhol, Lichtenstein, and Rosenquist, the mushroom cloud is an icon, a pure sign, and it receives the same artistic treatment as any other pop icon. But the image of the mushroom cloud had appeared a decade earlier. Here is Robert Frank's exquisite photograph of three postcards from which the tourist browsing the rack at the souvenir shop may choose: the Grand Canyon, the Hoover Dam, or the mushroom cloud. These are the main roadside attractions in Nevada, here proposed as interchangeably epic and spectacular. By this time, the mushroom cloud had been abstracted into a sublime event in a sublime location, the Nevada desert, aestheticized into a form with clear, recognizable shape, and marketed as a tourist attraction. It is precisely this aestheticizing that Jess's friend and San Franciscan Bruce Conner lays bare in his film Crossroads, made 20 years later, soon after Jess made The Fifth Never of Old Lear. Conner used recently declassified footage of Operations Crossroads, the atomic test detonations at Bikini Atoll in 1946. With half the world's available film on site to take some 1 million images, the explosion was the most photographed event in history. Conner edits the footage to repeat the event so that the film's viewer seems to watch this spectacle over and over and over from different viewpoints, and adds an electronic score by Terry Riley to reinforce the debilitating visual seduction induced by the explosion. Like Conner's Crossroads, The Fifth Never of Old Lear understands the deep contradiction of its subject, its representational double bind. But for Jess, allegory and theatricality suited the absurdity, the unrepresentability of the subject at hand, and picturing the moment of the world's wreckage through salvaged fragments of that world maintained a vivid and excruciating ambivalence. One final point as I approach my conclusion. Jess's worldview does not only derive from a threat of world annihilation, as his origin myth implies. His work and his model of self are founded on salvage, which stems from his encounter with nuclear waste at Hanford. For Jess, as for most Americans, the atomic bomb was experienced only indirectly. But nuclear waste was a part of his daily life at Hanford in 1948 and 49. And this, he later admitted, was why he abandoned science for art. More and more, I came to contemplate that utter impasse that confronts all production of nuclear materials, namely the impossibility of safe, for the planet Earth, disposal of radioactive, long-lived waste. So I turned to the playing field that had beckoned to me since childhood, and there I've been engaged for 50 years. I can hardly explain it more clearly. Jess's fears were well-founded. The Hanford site is now one of the most contaminated places on Earth and the most contaminated in North America. Hanford was a massive industrial complex with multiple reactors, processing plants, and hundreds of support buildings. It was difficult to find men and women willing to come to Hanford, a dismal frontier town plagued by sandstorms and threatened by constant contamination. As the workhorse of the nuclear industry, Hanford produced 75 tons of weapons-grade plutonium, with each gram of this plutonium generating 8,000 gallons of radioactive waste. When Jess was at Hanford, the brief was to produce as much plutonium as possible regardless of the consequences. Those consequences have been dire. By far, the greatest threat was from gaseous radioactive waste emitted into the atmosphere. And of these airborne emissions, iodine-131 was the most toxic and released in the greatest quantities from the stacks of Hanford's processing plants. Iodine-131 seeks the thyroid when it enters the body, which leads to cancer. Workers at Hanford had more than 70 times the recommended iodine levels in the thyroid. At Hanford, Jess worked to scrub excess iodine-131 from airborne emissions. His job then was to mitigate the most toxic aspect of the most toxic process at what is now the most toxic site in the United States. This was what he did every day for months. Jess's subsequent commitment to salvage must be understood in a larger frame, as a form of world building. In the shattered world of modernity, the collector, Hannah Arendt tells us, only needed to bend down to select his precious fragments from the pile of debris. And so Jess sifts from the wreckage of a world shattered by the atomic bomb and reverberating with the constant threat of annihilation, and a world in which reason has been displaced. After participating in this world shattering, Jess staged a break from that event and wrapped that break in the protective blanket of an origin myth, and then spent a lifetime salvaging a world from the discarded, rotting, neglected fragments surrounding him, finding a place within his self-made constellation in which they belong. Though, of course, the artist, too, himself was salvaged by his self-appointed task. A last word on belonging. One great fact of 20th century American poetic and visual art culture has been the capacious vitality of its margins. There is a need for an art history in the United States that fully admits this capaciousness as a salutary fact and works with a model that frees itself of center and periphery, or at least builds in a continual sense of the fragility of the US center in terms of cultural hegemony and the advantages of the wide, well-furnished margins. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you also to the organisers for the opportunity to present some of my ideas today in such esteemed and distinguished company. My paper will examine the influence of artistic innovations produced between 1945 and 1965 on contemporary Japanese art. I'm treating the post-war as a moment in which the strategies and concerns that would determine artistic practice from that point onwards were articulated. The long post-war period in Japan, which stretched from 1945 until the death of Emperor Hirohito, Japan's wartime monarch, in 1989, saw a great deal of artistic, political, and social change. The achievement of international economic ascendancy during the 1970s was compounded by the rampant commercialism of the 1980s, generating an art form, superflat, which privileged aesthetic experiment with the tropes of Japanese culture. Superflat, coined in relation to Takashi Murakami and articulated to its most extreme conclusion in his work, came to international prominence by means of its easy co-option by super brands. This style reigned supreme until very recently. The art critic Adrian Favell, who's done intensive work on contemporary art from the last few decades in Japan, attributes the end of superflat to the events of 2011, to the earthquake and tsunami in Tohoku Prefecture, and the subsequent nuclear crisis of Fukushima. The three contemporary exemplars I wish to discuss today, the Chimpom Collective, founded in 2005, Naoya Hatakayama and Koki Tanaka, seem dissatisfied with recent art historical precedent and instead mine the politicized avant-garde of the immediate post-war period in search of relevant and provocative strategies with which to respond to the nuclear events of 2011. The immediate post-war period, by which I mean both the US occupation lasting until 1952 and the early 1960s, was a turbulent time of difficult to negotiate politics. Consequently, the artistic developments of these decades have proved challenging to reconstruct. Though the occupation promised democratic freedoms, criticism of the occupation itself was discouraged. Former fascists and left-wing radicals alike were purged from public life. The work of renowned Japanese historian Maruyama Masao can help to explain how the environment, development, and defeat were mutually implicated. A love of nature, promoted by other 20th century ideologues, including D.T. Suzuki, who was extremely influential in spreading scholarship of Zen theology internationally. Suzuki and scholars like him celebrated the love of nature as a traditional Japanese virtue. But for Maruyama, the love of nature was incompatible with modernity, as there can be no autonomous, politicized individual within a culture that uses nature to legitimate its political structures. The authority of both religion and nature is rejected by modernity, a process accelerated by Hirohito's forced renunciation of his divinity during a post-defeat public address in 1945. This address suddenly destroyed the natural order, giving Japanese citizens the latitude to interrogate their social circumstances for the first time, as the Allies had intended, but also removing respect for the autonomy of nature, allowing Japan to become the world's most polluted country within 2 decades of Hirohito's address. Japan's prestige would no longer be found in the putative racial and spiritual superiority of its people, as it had been during the Second World War, and was instead to be found in industrial competition. Japan's repressive wartime government had been facilitated by the close relationship of government, civil services, and corporations, which permitted corruption and militarism and stifled democracy. It is thus ironic that a post-war emphasis on the economy further consolidated the power of these implicated corporate elites, who had been set to benefit most from Japan's wartime project. The repetition of charges of self-interest and inadequate regulation levelled at TEPCO, the management of the Fukushima plant, in the wake of the disaster there, reveals that these incestuous relationships between government and industry continue unabated. Observers both within and outside Japan have connected Fukushima to Hiroshima, thereby offering a fresh perspective from which to reframe 20th century Japanese history as a story of the chasm between the interests of political, industrial, and foreign powers against the citizens' demand for quality of life within their local, national, and international environments. With its dramatic and unprecedented history of pollution, including now 4 serious nuclear incidents, and in a social context where states have little scope to critique each other, Japanese artists hold a particular stake in questioning and raising awareness regarding environmental damage. The trope of the nuclear thus allows us to examine contemporary and post-war practices within a continuous trajectory and exposes the continuing influence of the post-war avant-garde and, unfortunately, conservative political structures. Though primarily a military deployment rather than an environmental incident, the curious politics of post-war Japan led the ecological consequences of Hiroshima to be emphasized. In 1954, American military tests on the Bikini Atoll, as we've seen in the previous talk, went awry, irradiating a Japanese fishing vessel. While it may have been contentious for defeated Japan to question the legitimacy of using nuclear weapons, attacking the incompetence that was demonstrated at Bikini was much less fraught, allowing Japanese citizens to represent political reservations of the use of nuclear weapons as an environmental protest. The fishermen of the Lucky Dragon were legally pursuing their livelihoods when they became innocent victims of nuclear recklessness. This distinguishes the Bikini incident from any events during the Second World War. This, then, is the origination of Japan's identity as nuclear victim rather than wartime aggressor. Some of Japan's foremost creative personalities produced powerful and evocative work on the theme, including Okamoto Taro, whose monumental painting The Myth of Tomorrow, inspired by the events of Bikini, depicts the traumas of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Bikini incident itself. This imposing 30-meter-wide painting, situated in Tokyo's Shibuya station and passed by around 500,000 commuters every day, is a constant public reminder of the nuclear hazard, yet the public has become inured to its presence and seemingly to its message. Looking for a model of artistic response to the nuclear, in 2011, Chimpom updated Myth of Tomorrow to include the Fukushima incident, bringing the painting to renewed prominence. Their intervention was controversial, mostly over fear that the nuclear meltdown Chimpom predicted might actually occur. Despite public opposition, their intervention led to their staging an exhibition at Okamoto's former home, now his memorial museum, in 2013. They filled one room of the house with landfill, a comment on development and pollution, and a theme that they have explored in their work before. Their interest in the environment originated with the problem of urban waste and predated Fukushima. But this installation included film of landfill sites in Fukushima, exposing how the problem of waste has now been exacerbated by the problem of radiation, because all of those landfill sites are now also nuclear waste disposal sites. By contrast, the other room they requisitioned, Okamoto's former bedroom, was purposefully minimal, containing only a small fragment of the older artist's bone. Hirano Akiome, director of the museum, issued the invitation to Chimpom in the belief that their response was similar to what Okamoto himself would have been doing to address the disaster were he alive today. They are responding in an accessible manner that stresses the long-term human costs. He also described the landfill film as a cenotaph to the deceased of Tohoku, whose lives have been consigned to oblivion. As in an atomic blast, many of the victims of the Tohoku tsunami and earthquake left no mortal remains. While some in the media have criticized Chimpom as provocateurs and the addition of Level 7 to Myth of Tomorrow as vandalism, their engagement with Okamoto, now rebranded as a collaboration, and the depth of consideration Fukushima has affected in their artistic development is bestowing a kind of legitimacy on the group. Their appropriation of Okamoto's status as the paramount articulator of a non-political, human-centered pessimism has helped their provocations to be received more seriously. But it has also purposefully highlighted the cyclical nature of the nuclear problem. While the three events depicted by Okamoto originated in military bombing or testing, the Fukushima nuclear leak was ostensibly an unavoidable natural disaster. However, in the days and weeks after the earthquake, that the reticence of TEPCO, media and government to deal with the risks effectively and transparently was itself exacerbating the fault became very clear. Thus, the leak at Fukushima is a man-made disaster, exposing the machinations of the political-industrial nexus. Furthermore, linking nuclear weapons to civilian nuclear power reveals the doublethink that's involved in a nation constitutionally renouncing nuclear weapons because of their unpredictable long-term consequences, but continuing to build nuclear plants along a tectonic shoreline. My next case study is also the artist most deeply personally affected by the 2011 disaster. Naoya Hatakeyama, a native of Rikuzentakata in Tohoku, lost his mother when his hometown was destroyed by the tsunami. Hatakeyama had been making documentary photographs of man-made detonations in the natural landscape since 1995, a series that does not make explicit reference to natural disasters or to bombings, but which inescapably invites comparison to them. The works evoke the sublime. Hatakeyama has spoken of his feelings of alienation in the face of large-scale and perilous natural objects. It would be a mistake, I feel, though, to read these photographs as exercises in aesthetics. Each work in the series documents a transient moment and acquires a critical dimension when it documents incursion into nature for the purposes of development. Hatakeyama was therefore well placed to become an artist of record for the Great Eastern Earthquake. He ceased work on the Blast series in 2011, retrospectively ascribing to it a eulogistic meaning. From then on, he has photographed Rikuzentakata. His works remind me of Tamatsu Shomei's photographs of the aftermath of the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, since both artists memorialize by means of synecdoche and find pathos in the detritus left by deceased persons who have left no other physical trace, whose bodies have never been found. Tamatsu produced his series of photographs of Nagasaki in 1961, publishing them alongside Domon Ken's earlier photographs of Hiroshima in a double volume that same year. As this double volume specifically, and Tamatsu's work in general, was so widely influential, certainly Hatakeyama has these works as a precedent, and whether the influence is subliminal or conscious is a question I will put to him in the course of my research. Tamatsu was sent to Nagasaki on a journalistic assignment. He did not choose to engage with the trauma. This is also broadly true of Hatakeyama, who documented Kesenuma in Tohoku Prefecture at the behest of Toyo Ito. In 2012, Ito represented Japan at the Venice Architectural Biennale with a pavilion based on rebuilding projects around Rikuzentakata, an area chosen in response to Hatakeyama's photography. Hatakeyama's photographs were displayed around the architectural models, acting as a proxy for his home district, in order to convey the relationship of the building to its site to visitors to the Venice Pavilion. 1 year later, Koki Tanaka's pavilion at the Venice Biennale reincorporated elements of Ito's award-winning presentation. Tanaka made the decision to reuse Toyo's pavilion before Toyo's prize was awarded, and I think that should be noted because Tanaka has come into some criticism for his decision to incorporate the previous display, seen as an attempt to associate himself with previous Japanese success. You can see that the elements that he's reused from Toyo's pavilion are these exposed cedar beams, which were also featured in Hatakeyama's photographs of Rikuzentakata, so this is a consistent motif within the three artists' output. By using Toyo's pavilion, Tanaka was trying to indicate that rebuilding is a collective project, that it is ongoing, and that it requires collaboration. It is ill-suited to territoriality and to authorship. Prior to 2011, Tanaka had been making works in which a group of skilled professionals, or strangers to each other, were set a creative task investigating the nature of cooperation and the limits of subjectivity. As with Chimpom and Hatakeyama, it was a pre-existing form suited to art-making post-Tohoku. He has no personal connection to Tohoku. In fact, he lives in LA, so his focus was rather on the impact on Tokyo, which also experienced significant disruptions, and where there were manifold expressions of kindness and helpfulness in the disruption that immediately followed the earthquake. The beauty of strangers helping each other, especially in a context where social isolation was becoming the norm, is reconstructed by his precarious tasks. The centerpiece of his 2013 pavilion was the film A Poem Written by 5 Poets at Once, which sees 5 writers struggle to reach a consensus on what form a collective creative process might take. The theme they work to, sharing an event with others, is determined by Tanaka, though this is the limit of his direction, and the participants have to navigate their own way through the difficult task. At one point, a participant states that, as poems, it is natural for us to share with words. seeming to indicate the special potential of creative activity to facilitate collective action, which is also the reason why Tanaka always selects a constructive and never a destructive act as the basis of his tasks. Commencing by analysing the very economic terms of the instruction, after a period of individual writing, they reach a shared definition of event, saying it is something that happens, not something you do. This passivity seems to reflect a post-disaster context. Other precarious tasks more explicitly recall the disaster. For instance, Tanaka staged a walk through Tokyo and Yokohama, which reminded participants of their walks home immediately after the earthquake when transport services were suspended. These processes sparked emotive conversations between the strangers involved. They also revealed Tanaka's connection to both recent and historical Japanese cultural practices. The act of walking was like an act of meditation, as you might find in Zen Buddhist practice, and it certainly had reflective and therapeutic benefits for the participants. Collective poetry writing also is a well-established practice in Japanese literature. In fact, his next task after the walk was loosely based on the tea ceremony and saw participants in LA each bring a tea bag to be brewed in a communal pot. Aside from this apparent drawing on tradition, his use of public participation, collaboration, and event performances is also determined by more recent precedents from Japanese history. In particular, Tanaka admires the work of experimental collective Higher Ed Center, whose happenings, often based in the street or held in other public spaces, have been linked to the work of Fluxus. Higher Ed Center melded protest and performance within a critique of Japan's self-conscious and potentially dangerous pursuit of international standing in solely economic terms. In this performance, they're critiquing local government initiatives to improve street hygiene and the environment of Tokyo in the run-up to the Tokyo Olympic Games. In 1964, Higher Ed Center staged Disaster Plan, in which members of the public and invited guests were subjected to arbitrary measurement. For example, the capacity of their mouths or how much water they displaced in the bath were recorded in order to provide them with a custom-built, but presumably entirely ineffective, custom-made nuclear shelter, parodying the futility of national preparedness initiatives after the advent of the hydrogen bomb. Tanaka has continued his precarious tasks since Venice, showing at last year's Frieze a remaking of one of Higher Ed Center member Jiro Takamatsu's instruction pieces, his remarks of 1974, in order to consciously update and connect the political moment of Japan in the 1960s and 70s to the current political situation. Takamatsu asked participants to try to repeat the content of a specific consciousness as many times as possible, which Tanaka rewords as, try to keep conscious about a specific social issue, in this case, anti-nukes, as long as possible while you were wearing yellow colour. Of the 3 case studies examined here, Tanaka's oeuvre most explicitly applies the political critique of the post-war avant-garde to contemporary environmental issues. These continuities both rehabilitate the historical and reveal how the selection of media and innovation of new forms are determined by the changing political motivations of artists over time. As Japanese artists develop the confidence to progress from document to satire to collective solution finding. In concert with these internal developments, concerns over the nuclear came no longer to be specific to Japan. Over the course of the post-war period, the global consequences of nuclear weaponry and civilian nuclear power use came to be widely recognized and feared. It is this new spirit of international empathy, based on the fear of the unprecedented destruction capacity of the nuclear, that lays ground for the hugely influential reception of Japan's contemporary art, with both Ito and Tanaka achieving acclaim at Venice and Chimbom beginning to find an international audience, which by extension raises the profile of those Japanese post-war artists that they celebrate and revisit, such as Higher Ed Center and Okamoto Taro. So the resurgence of these post-war concerns, a concern amongst citizens that a conspiracy between government and business determines the fate of the individual, and a belief that it remains the responsibility of the avant-garde to articulate those concerns, problematizes our conception of the post-war by asking what validity that periodization might have or lose when applied across the globe. Thank you.
In 1966, Matsuzawa Yutaka, the foremost conceptualist in Japan, made a radical proposition calling for the vanishing of all humankind. On a 17-meter pink banner, he inscribed, "Humans, let's vanish, let's go, Gyati, Gyati," wherein Gyati is Sanskrit word taken from the Heart Sutra, freely translated as "let's go." The message was issued under the auspices of the Anti-Civilization Committee, one of Matsuzawa's one-person quasi-collectives. Later, from 1970 onward, he incorporated this mantra of vanishing into his performance accompanied by this banner, which served as his ultimate calling card until his death in 2006 at 84. This short description of Matsuzawa's lifelong signature work may be enough to give you an impression of singularity, even insularity, the inscrutability of his work. His cosmic conceptualism, which made the whole universe into his subject, is certainly singular. Even Japanese art world has had a hard time with Matsuzawa. However, enigmatic as his theory and practice of psi may be, if we don't understand Matsuzawa's conceptualism, we only suffer an incomplete history of Japanese conceptualism, but also fail to understand the rich possibilities conceptualism pursued in the global 60s. The goal of this presentation is to unpack Matsuzawa's art of immaterialization and place it within the global narrative of post-war art traversing the Pacific and the Atlantic. In a broader context, Matsuzawa's conceptualism was decisively shaped by the post-war condition. His ground zero was the ruins of Tokyo after the US firebombing in March 1945. At the time, Matsuzawa was 23, studying architecture at Waseda University in Tokyo. Thanks to his major, which the state deemed technology and hence vital to the war effort, Matsuzawa was exempted from conscription but mobilized to work at a factory in Niigata away from Tokyo. Accordingly, he did not experience the raid on Tokyo, but when he returned to the capital, he was shocked to the core by its devastating aftermath. Like many progressive or otherwise reasonable people in Japan at that time, he knew that his country was fighting an unwinnable war. However, it is one thing to assess the enemy's military and industrial might. In abstraction, it is quite another to witness with his own eye the destruction wrought in reality. His graduation thesis in 1406 speaks loudly of his disenchantment with material civilization. In his thesis essay on the ruins, he poetically wrote, "That which humans make will eventually perish. Human will eventually perish." This sentiment was enforced in his speech at the graduation party in which he proclaimed, "I don't believe in the solidness of iron and concrete. I want to create an architecture of soul, a formless architecture, an invisible architecture." 2 years later, he gave up architecture altogether, returned home in remote Shimosuwa in central Japan, and began his probing search for the invisible, first in poetry and in art. It should be noted that the response by Japanese artists to World War II was not monolithic. For example, to indict the human follies of the war, Maruki, Iri, and Toshi depicted the horror of Hiroshima they witnessed in the immediate aftermath. Equally sickened by the war, Matsuzawa questioned human civilization itself built upon Enlightenment humanism and rationalism, which produced military technologies that took humanity almost to the brink of extinction. Or, to borrow his word, he questioned the nature of humankind who made the wrong things. Into the 50s, in his probe into the invisible, Matsuzawa experimented with intermedia. In 1954, he was instrumental in the founding of the Alpha Art Circle, an interdisciplinary collective. For its first and the only exhibition, Matsuzawa produced chemical paintings by coating rusted iron sheet with photochemicals. In retrospect, his wartime experience alone might not have led him to invent his cosmic conceptualism, which he declared not until 1964, almost 2 decades after the war's end. As vital was 2 subsequent ground-shattering moments that prodded him to proto-conceptualism and then to conceptualism. The first occurred at the end of his 2-year stay in the United States in 1955-57. Having spent 1 academic year in Wisconsin, he extended his stay for another year and headed to New York. His American years amounted to an occasion to sort through different contemporary ideas he had acquired secondhand in Japan while expanding his intellectual arsenal. His unspoken goal was to transcend the modern Western model of knowledge, which he perceived as having led to the wars. To make a long story short, most importantly, his abiding interest in the paranormal exploded when he discovered Long John Neville on WOR radio. For the next month, he immersed himself in the world of the legendary and innovative late-night talk show, which nightly featured all matters paranormal that defy the established parameters of modern science. Having absorbed enough, Matsuzawa cut short his stay in New York and returned home in March 1957. His transition to proto-conceptualism was fortified by 2 additional intellectual sources: contemporary physics and non-Zen Buddhism. A triple cocktail of knowledge that is weird, advanced, and non-Western has potent in its theoretical implications. All three embrace the potential of human mental faculties to investigate that which is invisible and improbable to the modern mind. Parapsychology embraces psi-power, which means cognitive ability beyond the 5 senses such as precognition and clairvoyance. And Matsuzawa adopted psi as the tag for his whole project. Contemporary physics is built upon hypotheses, that is, mental constructions about, say, the origin of the universe or subatomic state of matter, many of which may not be visually observed or materially tested. Non-Zen Buddhism, especially the faith of Amida, encourages kannen or meditative visualization of the invisible, such as the Buddha or the paradise. Those 3 branches of knowledge offer alternate paths to the unknowable. With his voracious transdisciplinary mind, Matsuzawa conducted extensive research in these and other areas of knowledge. His proto-conceptualism progressed from 1960 to 1964. In 1960, he devised the concept of work of art as apparatus, refuting the modern construct of work as a self-sufficient object. He envisioned his relational apparatuses to activate the viewer's mental faculty and generate an experience of the invisible through their visual elements. Beginning in 1961, he made a series of text-only works. And in 1963, he extended the idea of apparatus to the gallery, which he conceptualized as a temporary container to hold his various apparatuses. Yet, his proto-conceptualism was fundamentally saddled by materiality. Indeed, he was so obsessed with making materially based apparatuses that he eventually filled up a large reception room in his house, which became known as Psi, the Shiki Room. Something had to change in order for him to move forward. In the wee hours of June 1st, 1964, Matsuzawa had a reckoning that pushed him over the edge. The detail of this crucial moment that marks the birth of Matsuzawa's full-fledged conceptualism is shrouded in myth. Suffice it to say, inferred from the two text-based works he created immediately after the episode, the reckoning must have involved the notion of bushitsu shometsu, or vanishing of matter, and forced him to deliberate on ways to eradicate materiality in art that is an inherently material-based practice. His solution was to follow the principles of scientific hypothesizing and Buddhist meditative vision, thereby launching an art of immateriality. After the revelation, Matsuzawa developed his conceptualism in three areas: morphology, philosophy, and operations. Morphology was the first area he theorized as non-sensory paintings in 1964. But it was not until 1967 that he managed to formulate it in a viewer-friendly form. Philosophy, too, took him some time before he introduced the mantra of humans let's vanish in 1966. Notably, Matsuzawa quickly and prolifically developed a series of operations organizing immaterial exhibitions and immaterializing exhibitions. And this last aspect is where we can find exciting instances of resonances with his 60s peers. As demonstrated by the 2009 exhibition Voice, a retrospective at the Pompidou Center and Kunst, Bern, the empty gallery was a prevalent interest in 60s art. Curiously absent from the exhibition, Matsuzawa made the operations involving the empty gallery one of his key conceptualist strategies. The simplest form of this project was to present a physically empty gallery. He first did this in the last weeks of December 1964 using Naika Gallery in Tokyo. During the busiest day of the year in Japan before the New Year's celebration, few people would visit the exhibition anyway, and he literally closed the gallery. It was not unlike closing event, that Highlight Center had staged earlier that year at the same gallery, which pointed to the outside world as a panoramic landscape. Matsuzawa's empty gallery likewise pointed to the outside world, in his case, his residence in the countryside of Japan. His invitation envelope, sent empty of the contents, designates his home under the tag of Outer Space Situation Research Center as exhibition venue, where he would make public the environment where he had discovered the principle of non-sensory painting, that means his bedroom. It is countered by the empty gallery in Tokyo, designated as anti-venue. The pairing of venue-anti-venue was borrowed from the matter-antimatter hypothesis of particle physics. It also recalls Robert Smithson's site-non-site, which conceptually and physically connects a remote site where Smithson gathered rocks and a gallery site that contains the log pointing to their origins. Matsuzawa's anti-venue likewise points to a remote site that is his home and the nerve center of his immaterial operations. With Matsuzawa, empty is never literally empty, that is, never devoid of signification and function. On the announcement, he enigmatically wrote, "This envelope is empty, therefore it is endless." Given his use of the refrain "Gyati Gyati" in his anti-civilization mantra taken from the Heart Sutra, it is fair to associate this statement to the sutra's essential claim: form is empty, emptiness is form. Matsuzawa, however, went beyond the widely known sutra in his study of Buddhology. His 65 work, Voids, explains what void means to him. Let us think of void. It is not limited as existence. It is not limited to as existent or non-existent, also nothingness. It is a path for neither existence nor non-existence, but a state of dormancy. The state we desire is all being in void, living in void. This passage implies that Matsuzawa adapted the interpretation of void by the Madhyamaka school, Chuganha, one of the two major Mahayana schools that taught emptiness to be the middle path between existence and non-existence. This formulation helped him to differentiate his void from one-dimensional and rationalist concept of non-existence and nothingness, thereby opening a wide horizon of possibilities for his search for the invisible in his conceptualism. With this understanding, a comparison with his counterparts helps to explode the established narrative of global conceptualism. Matsuzawa's empty gallery recalls Yves Klein's empty room in 57 at Colette-Alendy, Paris, and its later iteration as a pure white empty room in material space realized at Museum Hans Lange Krefeld in 61. Two artists had a great deal in common, especially their engagement with the concepts of immateriality and void. Above all, their empty galleries involved a material reduction, yet the two artists had different goals and concerns. Klein intended to create the ultimate immaterial space so that the viewer may acquire a consciousness of immateriality. That is to say, void and sensory perception of it were the goal, to which the physicality of absolute nothingness was crucial yet literal. Matsuzawa's empty room was not his goal but means, constituting an apparatus that linked the empty gallery to his home and his spiritual conceptualism. Although he physically closed the gallery, the literal void was not as crucial to his operation. More generally, the presentation of void is far less important for him than the activation of the viewer's mental faculty to think of void. He didn't even need a physical emptiness for this purpose. For example, in 65, he mounted anti-civilization exhibition at the site of All Japan Independent Exhibition held at Yokohama Citizens Gallery. The flyer commands the viewer to mentally empty the whole exhibition and instead visualize a group exhibition of nil or nothingness at the same site. Although Klein's creation of an immaculate space was radical in his intention, the 61 iteration was not so much immaterial as material in that it physically occupies a museum and its upkeep necessitates certain resources like time, labor, and material. To keep the void pristine, in a sense, he created the materiality of immateriality. It is instructive to remember another experiment with the void by Klein in 58, presented at Iris Clot in Paris, titled "The Specialization of Sensibility in the Raw Material State into Stabilized Pictorial Sensibility." His attempt to sell immaterial paintings at this time points to the condition of Klein's operation, a market of art objects as commodity. In contrast, operating in the virtual absence of a market for vanguard art, Matsuzawa designated one of his immaterial paintings, White Circle, as painting that can be owned by all humans in 68. That means I have it, you have it, if you so wish. Generally speaking, with Matsuzawa's void, what counts is not so much the fact of material reduction, but that which is meditated on by the viewer, be it a mythology or a philosophy. The culmination of his empty gallery operations, My Own Death, presented at Tokyo Biennale 1970, was thus the most memorable with its combination of the immaterial operation and the immaterial philosophy. For this landmark international exhibition, Matsuzawa opted to keep his space empty, except for hanging 2 panels at either entrance, which bore the bilingual command. Let me read the English one. When you go calmly across this room, let go my own death across your mind in a flash of lightning. That is my future genuine death, and is similar not only to your own future death, but to the past 100 millions of human beings' death, and also to future 1,000 trillions of human beings. Expanding on his philosophy of vanishing of humankind, the work thematized the artist's future while connecting the past, present, and future of the entire human race. A gallery assigned to Matsuzawa served as a blank canvas in which the viewer might meditate on a memento mori of the post-atomic age, realized through his radical reconfiguration of what art could be. In conclusion, Matsuzawa's work did not merely dematerialize art, but immaterialize it by invoking the potential of human mental faculties, which makes his art a unique and indispensable facet of global conceptualism in the 1960s. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for your wonderful papers. That was really exciting, just in terms of seeing how the field is progressing and also to think about these issues that I care so much about it. I think this is a really useful opportunity to think a little bit about methodology. I feel like you've all taken very different approaches to writing a world art history and to imagining what those connections might look like. Reiko, you were thinking very much in terms of comparison, a methodology that I know you call similarity, dissimilarity, and really about finding deep connections, but also being very careful to do deep readings that expose the differences between works of art. So it situates these works of art within larger narratives without flattening differences. Sohl, I saw what you were proposing as being a certain kind of mapping of, what Namjoon Paik's imaginary would look like if we considered all of the different places that were a part of his experience. And I very much appreciated. That's a methodology that obviously that's very important to me, and that of course Hiroko Ikegami also pursued in very substantial ways. Majella and Tara, I felt like what you were doing with your 2 case studies spoke to each other very well in terms of having 2 very different artists from very different perspectives responding to one single event, to a historical event, and seeing what the reverberations of that event was in different times and places. I'm wondering if I could get you all to maybe reflect a little bit on the methodologies that you chose, perhaps, but also on what the other options are, how you see us moving forward collectively in the future, given that we're all sitting here and trying to work out what this would look like.
Okay, they want me to speak first, obviously, so I will. Comparison is just the necessary strategy when we have so many different places in one map, and then we want to make sense out of it. The only thing is, if we do comparison in much the same way as, say, literary, comparative literature, you assume the kind of Eurocentric level, and then without leveling the field, you compare. That's one kind of criticisms are leveled against the, that method. And instead, I'm thinking, and then many of us actually, on the panel actually, thinking from the bottom up, rather than coming from top down, the certain big abstract framework, but we want to look at the, what's beneath their feet, artist feet, or, they are in. Many different ways of doing it, and I really enjoy the Namjoon Paik, being different places in different ways, and then different, collaboration on network and so on and so forth. I thought that's very interesting. And then even the same disaster, the Tohoku, can bring about the very different the experiences as I'm sorry, Munro-san said. And then also in Jess's case, I was so stunned because I was like, okay, yeah, later, much later, reflection on A-bombs and yeah. And then suddenly, wow, he was at the, the ground. It's ground before zero, right? And then and then he's grappling with the, that fact. Much like actually Matsuzawa, I think, I found the way, but working it out over and over. So the comparative method works with other methods. It alone doesn't allow, like a deeper reading, as Min said. Biographical reading, maybe in one case, as I demonstrated today for Matsuzawa, you may create different type of narrative tangents to actually understand, say, Monoha or for Gutai in a slightly different angle with the conventional Japanese art history has done. So let me stop here.
The genesis of my project was an examination of art making post-Fukushima, which was just really too vast to even get started on. And the reason I was interested in it was because I felt a little bit concerned by the fact that the nuclear had come back to play as a theme in art. It's not something that concludes with the Second World War, with the post-war period. It's unfortunately something we are going to have to confront indefinitely. So it just made sense, because I was looking at that continuous interest, to pair up contemporary artists with post-war artists that had influenced them, and to use that as the structure for the research project going forward. But I was also particularly interested to hear Tara's paper, because like Reiko, I couldn't, it seemed again like a later intervention, and suddenly, oh, okay, now the logic of the putting these papers together is revealed. And it was a perspective I had never thought about before. I engaged so much with the Second World War and the atomic bombings in terms of a Japanese perspective, and it was really illuminating to hear that kind of guilt and need for expiation coming from an American source. And it's something I'm going to think about a lot more deeply, because I don't want to address any of these issues as local problems. They are not local problems. There is no such thing as a local nuclear incident. It is always global. So that's been really useful to me. Thank you.
I think what's fascinating for me here is this particular context, because the work that I presented today, it's part of a larger project that has been presented, for example, within the context of California art at the Pacific Standard Time conference, almost always within the context of American art, and so my gaze has always been very much in that direction. And so I was quite interested to see what this other context would bring about in terms of potential uncomfortable collisions or gaps or all of that. And I'm not. I see moments of intense connection, but I also see sort of things that are quite unbridgeable in some way. I'm feeling rather conflicted right now, and I mean, in terms of methodology, I would say I can't really. I suppose more I'm just struck by context and these different approaches and trying to get a sense of if it's of what the links and elisions are.
Thank you for the amazing question. The methodological question is always sort of in my mind, and especially now I'm at this point of thinking about a new project. And I think what Reiko said about the bottom-up methodology is certainly what I'm pursuing, thinking about the material reality, but also kind of broadcasting circuit as a reality of a particular locale, human bodies and other objects in a gallery space as phenomenological reality, all these things that actually kind of speak to a more metaphorical or meta level of reality that coexist. So layers of reality that exist in a particular locale at a particular time. And thinking about Nam June Paik, it would be really interesting to see not only the temporal disparity, but also kind of conceptual difference in his the reception of his works in Japan and Korea. So kind of when we go beyond the metropolis of, let's say, or Munich, Cologne, and Paris, London, and New York particularly for Nam June Paik, it would be interesting to see two local points that are so close to each other yet are so different. So by looking at this one particular artist, I would want to intervene into the national histories of art in both Japan and Korea. And also thinking about the model of collaboration, not only among individuals, but also individual and institutions. So that would be something that I'll be pursuing.
Thank you very much for wonderful papers. I have a question for Reiko TOMII. If you were to read about and Void in terms of biography, I wonder why you didn't really mention anything about John Cage, because I think he is really like, if Matsuzawa was in New York in the 50s, I think John Cage and Void and Buddhism was something which is perhaps more relevant than Yves Klein's Void Room.
With Matsuzawa, you can compare him in many different people, I think. And then with John Cage, his is the Suzuki Daisetsu inflected Zen Buddhism as a kind of westernized manner of seeing. I'm not saying that's wrong, just that's one way of that. And then Matsuzawa never referred to Zen because the essence of Zen is defiance of text and literature. You don't study but the sutras or even the written text, you just meditate upon the cue of the certain koan, and I see a big difference in it. So in a larger study, of course, it's a good thing to include, especially when Matsuzawa is in New York in '56. He was aware of what John Cage did, or Tudor did, or Rauschenberg did through different kinds of sources, and especially he saw John Cage's score published in Transformations, which is a major transdisciplinary journal published by Wittenborn in the early 50s, and he was rejoiced to see it, because it includes not only John Cage type of the experimental music, but also an essay by the Heisenberg, the quantum mechanist, and then the Buckminster Fuller, whom Matsuzawa respected, but actually rejected at the end, and so on and so forth. So in order to understand his intellectual and then kind of inspiration, the intellectual pursuit, certainly that's I am aware John Cage is one important figure to discuss. Also, probably you might have thought Yoko Ono is another person because almost they walked parallel path. And then probably the only difference is it's kind of difficult to say in one word, but if without both artists' work I respect, but the Matsuzawa earlier to start thinking about humanity as a whole, civilization as a whole, That's the origin of his art. Whereas Yoko started from music. And then that's a very different path to think about instruction or language as opposed to art or architecture where form is paramount. And then those things cannot be easily dismissed, especially because early 60s is the time of originalities, who's first, who's next, and then that's not a bad thing to think about. We art historians have to think about it, but that doesn't make a judgment, immediately being influenced with any artist, not influenced by anybody. I don't trust him or her. We are in the chain of a big, the history. But the problem is how you look at the influence, similarity, or dissimilarity, because there is a way to talk about it without making quick judgment or easy judgment. And then that's what I'm after, actually, in terms of my methodology.
I have a question which is a little abstract in my mind. I'll try to make it concrete. I feel there's an issue of temporality here, in a sense that we see a kind of singular moment of a nuclear disaster, explosion, or something like this that artists seem to constantly return to as almost like condensing the idea of war and destruction into a few seconds. And I see that this is very much the concept that we're all gathered here around, the idea of post-war, being after something. So do you think that this condition of being after something ends at some point? Is there a kind of end to because Majella's paper is very interesting in that respect, because I think there's a kind of return. But is the return just because Fukushima happened, or we've never been over the post-war? Do you see what I mean? There's something about the very term, every term that says post, it kind of establishes a moment you're after, but it doesn't say when it ends. So are these accumulated, or do we need another event in order to go back to this? Do we remember that we're post-war just because we have the war in Iraq? Or have we always been post-war and never gotten over it? Sorry, it's a little generic in general, but it seems to be a recurrent theme here.
Before we think about that question, let us think first about post, after, because when after begins is another issue. Because when we talk about A-bomb, Nagashima, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, we tend to think immediately after that, we meaning as a humankind, living on the earth, we all know that. That's not true. Because in Japan, the information about A-bomb was strictly suppressed. So I show the panels by Maruki, Mr. and Mrs. Maruki, which was actually a courageous act to get out the information when the whole incident was under the carpet or put under the carpet, and then they actually traveled the entire country to show that picture, to demonstrate. Not until 1952, after the end of occupation, and then America left the country as an occupying force, that the Japanese people come to know the reality. And then that was the powerful moment, like 1952, and then that was immediately followed by Fukuryama, the bikini, 1956, and then that's the Godzilla moment, which I think Alexandra Munro is going to talk about. So let's go to the when and end.
I've got a number of points to make about on that issue, and I'm not sure how coherently I'll make them, but periodization when we talk about the post-war is really, really important. I know that this conference is supposed to deal with 45 to 65, and my paper went well beyond those parameters. And another point that I tried to make in my opening is that a kind of accepted end of the post-war period in Japan would be 1989, which is taking us much further than the 60s. But it is comparable to Western cases and other cases internationally because it nicely coincides with the kind of end of the Cold War. So that's just a fortuitous coincidence that we can use a post-war periodization across these different states. But my personal feeling is that the post-war, we're still living with the same structures and the same hierarchies and many of the same problems. In Japan, Fukushima has exposed that, but somewhere like London, the financial crisis has exposed that. You often hear people saying that it's like living with rationing, or that it's like the 70s and that they have to put up with strikes and this kind of thing. So you can make the case that there are other circumstances creating similar resurgences of a post-war feeling in other states. There was something else I wanted to say, and it's just slipped away from me. Maybe it will come back while someone else is speaking.
Just quickly, not in this work of mine, but the other project on South Korean contemporary art, I actually try to look at or try to incorporate what historians historians working on the history of the Korean Peninsula into my art historical studies in a way that perhaps post-war period in Korea never meant starting from 1945 when the war ended and the nation was liberated from one colonizer by another force of imperialism. But thinking about post-Korean War, because it is really right after the Korean War that ended in 1953 that the nation began to think about its own national identity. And it's really when post-war period began in South Korea. So I know that in each locale, the temporality or the beginning of post-war may start in different time periods, and we can't just impose the period of post-war to all locations. And also, often in our history, we equate post-war with contemporary. So like post-war art or contemporary art. And I think we are all here to kind of question that. And
I would say that post-war is before contemporary if you're looking at art historical periodizations. But I also think that we have to ask what post-war, what are we speaking of? Are we speaking of an art historical moment? Are we speaking of a condition of social, political, cultural life? In some ways, I think that if you look at the 1950s in America, there was this constant rhetoric and of fallout shelters and radiation threats and potential annihilation. And in some ways, if we look at the effects of climate change and resource scarcity, there's some kind of frightening age of anxiety that is a return in that way. So I think it really depends on what you're applying the term to.
If we still have time for this question, it's come back to me what I wanted to say. Nobody minds.
I just want to, because the conference, the term post-war, is also bracketed by this geopolitical construct of the Pacific and Atlantic. I think it's important that we're very precise when we say post-war. And that is not just, there have been many wars since 1945. So each of them is post-war in the specific locality in which those conflicts took place. Mm-hmm. But post-war, generally understood, the term is really 1945 because it embraces the very geopolitical construct that shaped what we consider today the contemporary global, world. And I think it's undeniable that the very term post-war also mediates this set of relationships through the emergence of particular types of institutions, from the UN to the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institutions, to juridical codes that we are sort of reaching to, in a sense, universalize the relationship between different countries and so on. And so it's important that we don't leave that behind, because even Korea War was, fought not, under the shadow of the emerging post-war arrangement of the Pacific Charter in relation to the Atlantic Charter. So it's very important from a very historical, point of view that we understand what, post-war delineates here and why this very term, as malleable as you might think it, and especially for Majella, I would say that I'm a little bit disappointed in your paper in the sense that when you basically took the atomic, this relationship with Koki Tanaka and some of these artists, it would have been, for me, interesting to see how this return, because it's really this question of return to the aftermath, related precisely to the way in which the atom bomb mediates this experience, say, 50 years later. And that was not sufficiently underscored, for me. But I think it's important to simply to note that when we think post-war here, it's very important that it's a very geopolitical construct that embraces so many different things that are still being, kind of undone as we speak today.
Yes, thank you for your comment. I mean, if I've understood you correctly, the issue is with not being explicit enough about how the contemporary artists deal with the atomic bombings, the original atomic bombings. Is that a correct reading?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not, for me, I believe it's a cop-out to say that, the periodization of post-war, is not specific enough and not really to deal with the atomic bomb in the very, moment in which the experience of that within the global sphere was really dealt with, in a very, substantial way by artists, by thinkers, and so on. And I think that you can't just simply make that jump without creating a conceptual bridge for us, that really, enables us to understand that relationship in 2013 and at the Venice Biennale.
Right.
I've been waiting a little bit. Can I add to that? The last two comments I think are really important, and the conceptual bridge I think is something we're trying to fill, and it's not just a geopolitical break and a global geopolitical set of effects that we're looking at. It's a geotemporal one, going back to your question here, in the sense that what vanished in the Second World War was the possibility of many different kinds of futures that would in fact come about almost irrespective of what humans did. So futures generated by class struggle and so on, the different futures that are imagined under a sort of communist worldview, the futures managed under different forms of capitalism, the futures envisaged by fascisms of various sorts, many of the futures envisaged by dominant or less dominant world religions, and the ones that were less ideological. But futures of many different kinds were available and generated particularly throughout the 19th and 20th century as constant drivers. What to me the post-war moment shares on the level of the temporal is the evidence of how, as Tara just said, it could all evaporate. And this was something like all of us, like me, who were born at that moment, grew up as children experiencing on a weekly basis. We had to do fallout shelter practice, right? Even in Australia, who's going to bomb Australia? But we had to do it. So, but And I think the fascinating thing in the post-war period, from that point of view, is artists envisaging, along with many other people, how to fill that enormous void, how to actually, A, face voids, B, introduce different histories, new ways of living, new structures into those kinds of futures, revisit ones from the past that could be reconstituted, and so on. And that's the sort of interplay on the level of the temporal that goes into an array. We can talk another time about how our contemporary condition is constantly filled by pasts of various kinds, including many modern ones, as full as the debris of all kinds of pasts that keep repeating themselves. But that's another topic. But I'll just add, I really want to emphasize the geotemporal character of what we're talking about, which always is specific whenever it's sorted out in every place, but it does have that broad character as well, I think.
Okay, I've got two very, very dense critiques that I need to engage with, presumably quite rapidly. The first thing I want to say is that I am quite committed to the idea that the term post-war is contestable, but that is a much larger debate. The second thing is that it's, as far as I understand, this kind of slippage or the void of the engagement with the immediate post-war consequences of the atomic bombings is in the material itself. We're talking about a subject matter that artists were not really permitted to engage, and perhaps it didn't come across strongly enough in my talk, but until 1952, Japan was still occupied the US. There was no free and open political, social, or artistic discourse on the atomic bombings, which I think is something that Reiko hinted at towards in her discussion with the Ruki murals. And it goes back to this issue of condensing the war into one moment of an atomic engagement. And what we're dealing with is a question of witnessing and survivability. We don't have witnesses to the tsunami or to the atomic bombing because those events were not survivable. So we are always dealing with people who are looking backwards, retrospectively, and reconstructing from a subject position that is different to the subject position of the time. And the argument that I was trying to make is that because there was no open discourse on the atomic bombings, the Bikini incident really becomes very important in allowing those events to be recalibrated as an ecological issue so that we can talk about them openly. We're not talking about something geopolitically, purposefully, because we can't upset our allies. We're talking about the human cost and the environmental costs. So I hope that kind of fills in some of the gaps that might not have come across in the original paper.
Okay, thank you very much to our panelists. I think we exhausted you. We really